I want to bring in this question from Suge289, who says, why aren't we getting a wealth tax? Will, you wrote about this recently for the New Statesman. It's crucial to ask not just why aren't we getting a wealth tax, but also would a wealth tax work? What did you find out?
So thank you for your question, Suge289. A question also being asked by a lot of people with megaphones outside the Treasury yesterday.
And by Diane Abbott as well.
Yes, yeah. So there's about 30 MPs who want the answer to this question. And they're phrasing it as you could replace the cuts you're making to welfare with a wealth tax, say, of 1% on people with assets of over £10 million. So the most popular answer to that question is no, you can't have a wealth tax. Firstly, because in the first case, the OBR would just not let you score it in the same way. You can't have a fiscal plan where you say we are going to raise 10 billion a year or 24 billion a year, as I believe the Green leader, Carla Denyer, thinks it would raise, by this untried measure that has failed in lots of other countries. So I think it's been tried in 11 other countries, and nowhere yet has it raised a very significant amount of money. They're very hard to implement because people with lots of money are very good at moving their money around and hiding it. They employ teams of people to do that. In some countries, it's found to be illegal. So like the Spanish wealth tax, for example, very difficult to implement, raised sort of about £500 million. So, when you compare that to things like national insurance or capital gains, or even the kind of changes that Labour have made to the non-DOMS regime, that's not a hill of beans and not worth the potential risks of, deterring investment in British businesses or causing, wealthy people who, much as you might find them annoying, do actually already pay quite a lot of tax, causing them to move abroad. But I think it's also worth saying that to quote from a popular meme, it didn't work in all of those different cases, but it might work for us.
Okay, why might it work for us?
Well, I mean, in principle, you could say, look, people with assets over £10 million, that is probably about, according to some academic work that's been done on this, that's sort of less than 25,000 people. It would, in theory, be possible to do a full market valuation of all of their assets. So good as they are at hiding their wealth, it is quite common for full market valuations of rich people's assets to be done. It happens in the divorce courts all the time. And there are teams of people on both sides of those decisions who make sure that all of the assets are found. And, rich people themselves keep pretty close tabs on how much money they actually have, whatever form it might be stored in. So were it possible to just pick on that really very small group of people, do a full valuation of their assets, and then apply, say, 1% on all of your wealth over 10 million, it would, and for somebody with at the bottom end of that, 10 million quid, that would mean that they would have an extra yearly tax bill of 10 grand, which to somebody with that much money is probably not worth moving abroad for. It's also worth saying that that initial objection that would be made to this policy, were it to be introduced, the kind of millionaire exodus idea, that claim has already been made about the non-dom regime. There have been a lot of headlines on the idea that 10,000 millionaires have left the UK, after Labour came in. I do not think that number is serious. That number was provided, and this is what is almost never said by the articles under those headlines, by a company that provides migration services to rich people.
Yeah.
It is not
they would
possible.
say that, wouldn't they?
They would say that. It's their business to say that. And it is not possible for that company to know what the residence of all of those 10,000 people is, because only HMRC knows that. They can't find it out. A lot of it was based on publicly available data. It's an extrapolation from a certain number of people. One source said to me that number of people might have been less than 200 people who have changed their status on LinkedIn. So it's not a serious number. I think it's not a number you can base government policy on.
Okay, so the fleeing millionaires argument, we need to take that.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was a very, very lucid and extraordinary detailed explanation of the case for and against. I would just add a couple of tiny things on the politics of it. Wealth tax, I can see the attraction of it, but there's always a point. Will makes the point that so far not that many people have left the country, but there's always a kind of a moment when that changes, when it becomes too much. Quite a lot of people are leaving at the moment and moving their businesses to all sorts of weird places like northern Italy and Dubai and so forth. And the problem politically is that to assess people's wealth in detail to do this is going to be highly intrusive. And suddenly lots and lots of people are going to have, government employees, as it were, checking up on their paintings and the cars in their garage and exactly how much the outhouse is worth and all the rest of it. That is going to cause a huge ripple of anger and so forth. It's the kind of thing a Labour government can do in the first year. But I think the nearer you get to an election, the harder the politics become. I was talking to Paul Johnson of the IFS about this, and he said, actually, if we're interested in wealth, in taxing wealth, because there is a big, big economic and moral case for taxing wealth, then we should be looking at council tax first, because this is a potential wealth tax, which is not properly implemented in the UK. So you have all the very, very wealthy people in the south of England paying less council tax than really quite impoverished families in places like Bolton and Lancashire and so on. Get that sorted first. I'd be very, very interested in Will's view of that, because it did seem to me to be the missing part of the argument.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's the key part of the argument against a wealth tax, is that there's loads of other tax reform you can and should do first. Council tax is the big one. Because it's based on somebody driving past your house in 1991 and
guessing what it might be worth.
I reckon that might be worth that much. So that's the amount of tax it's going to pay for decades and decades to come. And as Andrew said, that creates enormous disparity in council finances across the country. You can also, but it would be an enormous political fight were you to try to
something else that you should probably do at the start of your parliamentary term.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you could also increase capital gains tax in line with income tax. You could get rid of national insurance, as Jeremy Hunt said he was going to do. What Jeremy Hunt didn't say was how he's going to pay for it. But were you to get rid of national insurance and replace it by increasing income tax for a few points, you would effectively give a tax break to workers and a tax hike on landlords, which a lot of people might think is a good thing. You could bring in, still more potentially, if you're going to have the big fight over council tax, you could have an even bigger fight and bring in a land value tax instead. There are loads of other stuff that you can do that might raise more money, frankly, than a one-off wealth tax. A big point in favour of a wealth tax, I did a bit of back-of-the-envelope calculation just now. And so James Dyson is one of the biggest taxpayers in the UK. He is thought to pay something over £100 million a year in tax. Great. Thanks very much, James. Were you to bring in this 1% wealth tax, you would then be looking at his tax bill might treble to sort of 300 million a year. And there would certainly be some screaming from the front page of the Telegraph by him, which would be very entertaining. And that's one point in its potential.
So your case for a wealth tax, it would be entertaining for journalists.
It would annoy James Dyson, but. On the other hand, that raises the issue. You might not get the millionaire exodus, but you might get a billionaire exodus, because most of the money that would come from a wealth tax would not actually come from, an investment banker with a fortune of 10 million quid. It would come from some of the very, very wealthiest. And their wealth is almost entirely tied up in the value of their companies. And although that is very clearly valued by financial markets, it's also not quite as real as some other wealth.
It's not as liquid.
Yeah, it's I've previously said that maybe Elon Musk isn't really the richest man in the world, because were he to start selling his Tesla shares, they would collapse in value. and he wouldn't be the richest man in the world anymore. That is true at a much smaller scale for somebody who might have built up a company that is worth £1 billion on a London stock market. If you start then charging them 10 million a year in extra tax, they might start to have some very different ideas about where they should float their company, where its headquarters should be, and things like that. So I think the risk is credible.
Just on the politics of it, on Monday, I was reading the report from the Growth Commission, which is the organisation of economists who are, should we say, Liz Truss friendly, who are still out and about making the Liz Truss case for growth. And their advice to the Chancellor ahead of the budget was to make a whole lot of tax changes, including reversing the scrapping of non-dom status, including reducing corporation tax in the UK, basically to avoid the exodus of millionaires. So you're already getting the argument that the current system is hostile to millionaires without bringing in any of these extra measures. But I think what we've got from this is, if we did try and implement some kind of wealth tax, it would be a lot harder and it wouldn't raise anywhere near the sums of money that are sometimes thrown around.
Yeah, I mean, I think to a certain extent there's a principle that wealth can take different forms. Like, look at the argument between the farmers and the government, right? You know, farmers have kind of unintentionally built up a great deal of wealth because the land that they want to use for work is also being used for tax avoidance by rich people. So it has become two forms of wealth for two different people. It's become a productive asset and an unproductive asset. And the tax system doesn't really recognize that. So in a way, the blunter the tax, the more unintended consequences it's going to have. And a simple 1% wealth tax would be a very blunt tax. And the blunter the instrument, the more unintentional damage it's going to do.